We're going to talk about what is asset protection, what are the risks that we're talking about, the 3 strategies, which we'll go into, how to set up your companies and trusts, and what happens when it all fails. Whenever anybody talks about asset protection, I think it does have a little bit of a bad name. And I think that generally is the case because when most of us first talk about asset protection, it's usually in the context of either with a tax advisor perhaps talking about a reason other than saving tax for a particular structure or a particular transaction. Or the other times when we talk about asset protection, the client comes in, their eyes are sort of dilated and they're about to go broke and they want to know how they can protect their house. So if that's in that context, there really isn't a lot that you can do. For me, asset protection is really a state of mind. It's a way of approaching business decisions as you go through the business life cycle so that you have the best opportunity possible to keep the wealth that you're building within your business. And there aren't any quick fixes, in my view. And obviously there's a lot of people who are out there promoting quick fixes, and really my only advice about that is to ask them for testimonials of when that has actually worked. Not has it been put in place and have they got away with it so far, but have they actually gone through an instance where they've been under serious attack and it's withstood that. And if that is the case, then it's probably something worth looking at. So in the context of asset, what are we talking about? We're talking about keeping the wealth that you've built up in your business and also outside your business. So for a lot of small business people and medium-sized business people, and in fact even larger businesses, most of their wealth is actually embedded within their business, within the goodwill, within the assets, within the plant and equipment that they've been building up in their business. And as we said in the invitation to the seminar, the problem with that is that's also where the most risk in their life lies, where the most chance of something going wrong within their business. So we'll talk about how to deal with that tension. But there's also the issue of the business being a source of risk that can spill over and attack the wealth outside the business, the primary one being obviously people's houses, and then your investments and those sort of things. So we'll talk about those 2 issues. I see asset protection as sort of a subclass or even a cousin of risk management. And risk management is a science. It's not an art, it is a science, and people have spent a lot of time analysing it. And there's some pretty clear things you can do. You need to identify the list, you can identify risks, you can eliminate them, you can lower them, and if you can't eliminate or lower them, then you need to manage the outcomes of those risks. So you need to think about what could go wrong, how likely is it to go wrong? So what's the impact? And then can I avoid it going wrong? Can I just take it off the table? And if I can't take it off the table, can I lower the chances of it occurring? And finally, if I can't do that, it's just something that will occur. How can I manage the impact so that it's going to have, it's not going to be completely destructive? So just to put asset protection in some context, if you look up Wikipedia, it says that modern asset protection started in the 70s when a US attorney helped the Cook Islands out in putting together some trust legislation that had some of the elements that sort of came to be known as asset protection, which is putting assets remote away from the court's jurisdiction and also providing some privacy around those assets. But I actually think that in the context of what we're talking about, which I'll call it genuine asset protection or legitimate, it really, I think you can go back as far as the Crusades, where the knights would entrust what the king had given them, their lands, to a brother or a cousin while they went away to the Crusades. And if they didn't come back, then it would be protected down their family line. And if it did come back, they could take it back off the person or the custodian or the nominee who had held those lands for them when they went away to business, which was in those days for a knight going to a crusade in the Middle East. But I think even more fundamental than that, asset protection is a natural human instinct, and it's something that I think really goes back as far as you can think. And certainly within Europe, in European jurisdictions, asset protection and the use of professional trustees and those sort of things have been around for many, many centuries. So I think it's worth touching on, is asset protection moral? Because we all need to be able to participate in this debate and advise clients, or if clients assess what people are telling us in the context of how it fits within society. And you might well be thinking, oh my God, what did I come here for? This seems a little bit off the beaten track, but I don't think it is. I think it ties in. So we need to ask ourselves the question, is it fair to take positive steps to protect what I've built up? And is there a limit to those steps? And I use the analogy of, is it fair to drive a really, really big car so that when you hit someone on the road, you're okay, but you crush the other car? That's a form of asset protection for your family. And is that fair? And fundamentally, is it a moral argument? I think it's actually a little bit simpler than that. I think it's a balance. It's to what extent do we as a community want to encourage risk-taking versus potentially encouraging irresponsibility? And when we assess the laws and we assess our strategies in dealing with asset protection, we need to have those two things in mind. If you ask a liquidator what he thinks of asset protection, he's going to say something along the lines, it's a way of making sure that, it's the way business people, unscrupulous business people, get away from meeting their creditors. If you ask the tax office, they'll say that it's a way of people not paying their fair share of tax. Endangering employees is probably what a union representative would talk about. And polluting the environment maybe might be Greenpeace's view. And funnily enough, if you're a chartered accountant or a CPA or a lawyer or a pharmacist or a doctor, up until very recently, your professional body said it was unprofessional of you to have limited liability, which is a form of asset protection, because it would encourage irresponsibility. And that's within my professional life that was a factor. So what they're saying is there needs to be an incentive to take care. And this is the sort of, the way it's summed up. You've got a financial and moral responsibility for others, and if there aren't any consequences of you doing something wrong, then you'll act irresponsibly. So that's one side of the argument. The other side of the argument is we need risk-taking. Risk-taking is the basis, is the fundamental basis of first world development and really accounts for most of our lifestyle. And as people, as entrepreneurs or people in business, we need to ask ourselves, is it worth it in the context of the responsibility that's being put on us? We need to encourage risk-taking, and allowing some level of asset protection in the community is the only way to do that. And that was the whole basis of the limited liability company, when people wanted to limit what they would put into a ship which would then go across the seas and see if it could make some money. So the key thing is being able to limit the risk, limit what you put on the table, limit what can be lost. And it also applies to other social activities. If you're in a club or if you're in a charity, the same things, the same principles apply. Is it worth taking the risk and taking the responsibility to help the community out in a particular way? Where I come down on the balance of those arguments is that, as far as I've observed, most business people and most people who are involved in social activities are very responsible. And for that reason, I probably, obviously err on the side of encouraging risk-taking and encouraging a healthy level of asset protection. To put it in context of what we're dealing with, I think the pendulum has swung back the other way a little bit, in the sense that there are currently 700 plus different laws that make a director responsible for the debts, obligations and liabilities of companies. So that pierces the corporate veil. So it's contrary to that whole policy of creating limited liability for directors, so that risk-taking and that entrepreneurial activity can happen in the community. And a lot of those, not just making you liable for a financial responsibility, but can put you through civil penalties and criminal prosecution, and you can end up in jail. And it really is scary when you do the internet searches and find out just how many of those exposures exist. So even the current government acknowledges that we need a level of asset protection and limited liability to encourage wealth and job creation, and part of that has been the introduction of some laws to limit criminal fault. So the good news is that I've just talked about 700 laws that are going to make you liable for what's going on within your business. But at the other hand, there is at the federal level and also at each of the state levels a swing back where they're introducing legislation which is arguing about this framework between risk-taking and responsibility and actually pushing it back the other way. So that is some good news, but there's still a tremendous number of things that risk-takers are being made responsible for. Another issue that comes up is this concept of Phoenix. There's been some recent changes in 2012 in relation to making directors responsible for the PAYG and superannuation guarantees and the director penalty notices, which I won't bore you with the details, but basically pushing further back on the responsibility side of the pendulum. I divide Phoenix activity into two pots, the contrived Phoenix and the genuine Phoenix. And the contrived Phoenix is where really you have to hide assets. You have to break the law in order to rise again. Whereas a genuine Phoenix is where you just put some resources and money on the table, go into a business, lose your money, learn a lot of lessons, and have another go. And to the extent that you buy those assets at market value, my view is you should be able to have another go. And any community that punishes people for coming back is one that is going backwards as far as economic development. In Australia, I don't think we make the distinction between genuine and contrived phoenixes. In fact, I think we go even further and we actually say, well, once you're a failure, always a failure, and you're probably a crook as well. And I think that genuinely is the way we see that sort of activity, and I think that we need to push back. So, there we go, it's my little rant. We'll get to the sort of more the substantive issues that we're here to talk about, which we need to identify what the threats are.